In the final days of April 1945, while Soviet bombs shook the foundations of Berlin, a coded message arrived at a subterranean bunker located 9 meters below the Reich Chancellery. The message contained a simple yet devastating question. Where were the divisions that supposedly were to save the capital? The answer was terrifying in its simplicity. Those divisions did not exist. They had been destroyed weeks earlier in battles that were never accurately reported. The generals who received the orders from that damp and claustrophobic bunker moved ghost over outdated maps, planned counter-offensives with armies that only existed on paper, and promised victories that they knew were impossible. What led millions of German soldiers to continue fighting when defeat was evident? Why did the generals execute orders they knew were suicidal? How was it possible that a military system that once dominated Europe transformed into a machine of systematic self-destruction? The answers to these questions reveal one of the most complex tragedies of the Second World War. It is not simply a matter of blind fanaticism or institutional cowardice. The history of the final orders of Adolf Hitler is the story of how a system built upon absolute obedience crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions, dragging millions of people with it toward an abyss of unnecessary suffering. Between July of 1944 and May of 1945, 49% of all German military deaths of the Second World War occurred in just 10 months. Almost half of all the German soldiers who perished in 6 years of conflict died after the failed assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20th, 1944. These numbers are not mere statistics. They represent millions of truncated lives, shattered families, and a suffering that could have been avoided. The transformation of the German High Command from a professional institution to an instrument of ideological fanaticism was a gradual process that reached its maximum point during the final months of the war. The Wehrmacht had entered the conflict with a Prussian military tradition that valued tactical initiative, operational flexibility, and apolitical professionalism. By 1945, those principles had been systematically dismantled and replaced by a culture of blind obedience, where questioning orders equated to treason. But this is also the story of those who dared to disobey, generals who sabotaged orders of mass destruction, commanders who reinterpreted suicidal directives to save lives, officers who chose court-martial rather than executing collective death sentences. Their decisions, taken in the darkest moments, saved entire cities from annihilation and preserved the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. What secrets did those final orders hold? What psychological mechanisms kept a doomed military machinery functioning? And what does all this teach us about the limits of human obedience? The summer of 1944 marked the definitive breaking point for the Third Reich. In the first days of June, while Allied forces disembarked in Normandy, establishing the beachhead in France, the German military machinery simultaneously faced a catastrophe of historic proportions on the Eastern Front. Operation Bagration, launched by the Red Army just 3 weeks after D-Day, crushed the German Army Group Centre in a series of concentric envelopments that left the Wehrmacht bleeding out entire divisions. In little more than 2 months, Soviet forces advanced over 600 kilometers to the west, liberating Belarus and reaching the gates of Warsaw and the borders of East Prussia. The collapse was so rapid and so complete that Allied military analysts initially doubted the intelligence reports. It seemed impossible that the army which had reached the outskirts of Moscow could be destroyed with such speed and efficiency. Hitler observed this double collapse from his headquarters in East Prussia, with a mixture of strategic denial and fanatical determination. The German leader, who since the winter of 1941 had personally assumed operational command of the Wehrmacht, began to respond to each crisis with increasingly rigid instructions that forbade any retreat movement. Traditional military logic was systematically rejected. In its place, Hitler implemented a system of orders based on absolute will and fanatical resistance. Every city, every town, every position had to be defended, regardless of the consequences. The doctrinal shift had deeper roots than mere military desperation. Since the Battle of Moscow, in December 1941, Hitler had developed an unshakable conviction. His order to hold positions at all costs during that first Russian winter had prevented the total collapse of German forces. The tactical success of that rigid resistance transformed in his mind into a universal strategic truth. Every subsequent retreat was seen as a betrayal of that saving principle. Generals who suggested withdrawals were accused of cowardice. The objective reality of the battlefield was subordinated to the belief that iron will could compensate for any material disadvantage. This transformation reached its crudest expression in February 1944, when Hitler declared that the war had entered a decisive phase. During a meeting with General Kurt Zeitzler, he made it clear that any suggestion of retreat would be interpreted as defeatism. Officers who proposed withdrawals would be dismissed and replaced by younger and more fanatical commanders. This threat was not empty rhetoric. Throughout 1944 and early 1945, dozens of experienced generals were removed and replaced by officers whose main qualification was their willingness to execute suicidal orders without questioning them. The Nikopol crisis perfectly illustrated this dynamic. When Soviet forces threatened German positions in this manganese-rich region of the Dnieper, essential for steel production, Zeitzler proposed an orderly retreat to straighten the defensive line. Hitler's reaction was explosive. He lunged over the map table, crumpled the plan, and shouted that the generals must understand why he clung to every territory. It was not about operational experience, but about strength of character. The city had to become an impregnable fortress. This approach produced devastating consequences. German units that could have been saved through tactical retreats were trapped in unsustainable defensive pockets. The soldiers fought until ammunition and supplies ran out, then were massacred or captured. Losses multiplied exponentially. German divisions bled out in battles without strategic meaning. The Wehrmacht transformed into a static army, condemned to defend positions until annihilation. But how was it possible that professional generals, trained in the best military academies of Europe, accepted orders that violated all the principles of modern warfare? The concept of the fortress city emerged as the most visible manifestation of this doctrine. On March 8, 1944, Hitler issued Führer Order No. 11, establishing the creation of strongholds on the Eastern Front. These fortresses were to allow themselves to be encircled to immobilize enemy forces. The theory was simple. A surrounded garrison would force the Soviets to divert troops, slowing the general advance. In practice, this strategy ignored the realities of modern warfare. The designated cities lacked fortifications, natural defences, heavy weaponry, and adequate supply. Tarnopol was the first victim. This small Ukrainian city lacked everything necessary to withstand a siege. Its garrison of 4,600 soldiers possessed few heavy weapons and scarce artillery. Basic rations were lacking from the first day. When General Hans Schirmer assumed command on March the 10th, his first action was to request a functional radio because the city lacked operational communications. His second act was to send a message to Hitler explaining that the situation was desperate. He was dismissed immediately. His replacement arrived at the same conclusion and was also ignored. The result was predictable and brutal. The defenders resisted for weeks until the garrison was annihilated in April, having achieved 0 significant strategic objectives. The pattern repeated itself across the Eastern Front. Breslau was declared a fortress city in August 1944. Hitler ordered that it be defended without retreat or surrender. The siege that began in February 1945 and lasted 82 days devastated the city on a scale that surpassed Berlin or Dresden. By the time the garrison surrendered on May 6, 2/3 of Breslau lay in ruins. The civilian population was trapped in this apocalyptic violence. Königsberg faced a similar fate, designated an invincible bastion by Hitler. It was surrounded and besieged. Civilians who had not evacuated were trapped. Orders forbade preventative evacuations under the theory that civilian presence would raise the morale of the defenders. When it fell, it had been devastated. On the Western Front, the dynamic was similar. After Normandy, German forces fought fiercely for 2 months. Hitler insisted on the primacy of the West, concentrating resources there while the East collapsed. When the Western Front crumbled in August, the Allies advanced toward the German borders. Hitler's response was characteristic. He gathered all available forces and launched the Ardennes counteroffensive in December. The Battle of the Bulge represented Hitler's final strategic gamble. His goal was to divide Allied lines, retake Antwerp, and fracture the alliance between Great Britain and the United States. German generals did not share the enthusiasm. They knew that the Wehrmacht of 1944 was not the force of 1940. But Hitler insisted. The offensive began on December 16th with a surprise attack that initially caught American forces off guard, but the advance stalled rapidly. By the end of December, the German momentum had halted. The battle cost more than 80,000 American casualties and between 80,000 and 100,000 German casualties. The strategic cost for Germany was greater, 2 fewer panzer armies to defend against the Soviet offensive. On January 12, 1945, the Red Army launched its massive winter offensive from the Vistula. The forces of Konev and Zhukov swept away German defences with overwhelming numerical superiority. The Soviets outnumbered the Germans 5 or 6 to 1 in troops, 6 to 1 in artillery and tanks. In weeks, they liberated Warsaw, took the Baltic states, captured Danzig, and approached the Oder, less than 100 kilometers from Berlin. Hitler faced this catastrophe with an obstinacy that defied all logic. He refused to halt the Ardennes and transfer troops to the east. He refused to evacuate 30 isolated divisions in Courland. Guderian was left with only 12 armoured divisions to support 50 weak infantry divisions stretched along 1,000 kilometres. It was simple mathematics. Germany did not possess enough soldiers to defend such an extensive front against such a superior enemy. Thus was born the context of Hitler's final orders, a combination of catastrophic military reality, total ideological denial, and absolute authoritarianism. The German generals functioned as mere transmitters of demented orders. The command system had transformed into a rigid structure where loyalty to Hitler superseded any military consideration. And millions of Germans, both soldiers and civilians, would pay the ultimate price for this systematic madness. What mechanisms kept this machinery of destruction functioning? How was it possible that officers trained to think strategically turned into executors of collective death sentences? The turning point arrived with the failure of the assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20th, 1944. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb in the East Prussian headquarters in an attempt to assassinate the Führer and trigger a military coup that would negotiate peace. The bomb exploded, but Hitler survived with minor injuries. The revenge was immediate and brutal. Thousands of officers, officials, and intellectuals were arrested. Hundreds were executed after summary trials. The purges eliminated any trace of potential opposition within the army and ensured that no military elite would dare to mobilize against the regime again. The psychological impact of the attack on Hitler was profound and lasting. His distrust towards the officer corps turned into active paranoia. Aristocratic generals with monarchist roots were now considered potential traitors. Only officers whose loyalty to National Socialism was beyond any doubt could hold positions of real authority. Professional military competence became secondary to political loyalty. This transformation had devastating consequences for the operational conduct of the war. The Führer's popularity was in freefall by 1944 and 1945. Allied bombings had destroyed entire cities. Casualty lists reached astronomical numbers. Food and fuel shortages affected even previously protected urban areas. Goebbels' propaganda about final victory sounded increasingly hollow, but the Nazi regime, coordinated by Martin Bormann, had increasingly assumed control of the German state apparatus. displacing the traditional civil bureaucracy. The post-July 20 purges ensured that no elite opposition dared to organise. However, the climate of intimidation was not limited to the upper classes. Ordinary soldiers who showed signs of weakness or defeatism faced immediate and lethal consequences. Mobile courts-martial roamed the rear areas looking for deserters. Military tribunals handed down death sentences with terrifying speed. Thousands of German soldiers were executed by their own compatriots during the final months for crimes such as abandoning positions, attempting to surrender, or expressing doubts about the final victory. The executions not only punished the accused, but served as a brutal warning. The bodies of the executed were left hanging in public places, with signs identifying their supposed crimes. A soldier could be shot for retreating without explicit orders. An officer could be hanged for suggesting a position was indefensible. A commander could face a court-martial for evacuating civilians without authorization. The message was clear. The only option was to fight to the death or face execution for cowardice. This atmosphere fundamentally transformed the relationship between officers and soldiers. Field commanders, who traditionally had exercised considerable discretionary authority, now operated under constant surveillance. Political commissars of the Nazi Party, SS officers, and security agents monitored military units looking for signs of defeatism. A general who ordered a retreat without explicit authorization risked not only his career, but his life. A colonel who expressed doubts could be denounced and arrested. A captain who showed compassion toward the civilian population could be accused of weakening the will to resist. The generals faced a terrible dilemma. Many recognized that the orders they received were militarily absurd and inevitably led to greater losses, with no strategic benefit. They knew that defending every town and every city until annihilation simply accelerated the total destruction, without slowing the enemy advance. They understood that fortress cities were death traps that wasted valuable soldiers. But they also knew that disobeying openly meant immediate execution and replacement by a fanatic willing to execute those same orders. This situation produced varied responses. Some generals opted for blind obedience, executing every order regardless of how irrational it was. These officers had internalized Nazi ideology or decided that their survival depended on total conformity. They followed directives to the letter, sacrificed entire divisions, and reported non-existent tactical successes to maintain the illusion that their iron will was working. Other generals adopted a more subtle strategy of passive resistance. Officially, they accepted the orders, but implemented them with modifications that softened their most lethal aspects. A commander might receive instructions to defend a city to the last soldier, but interpreted this as defending until the situation was clearly impossible, before authorizing a nocturnal retreat. Another general might receive orders to hold a specific line, but gradually reposition his forces through technical adjustments that fulfilled the letter while violating the spirit. This passive resistance required considerable political and military skill. Generals had to demonstrate sufficient public fanaticism to avoid suspicion while making decisions that saved German lives. They had to report their actions consistently, with the orders received while having taken different paths. They had to balance nominal loyalty to the regime with real responsibility toward their troops and the civilian population. A notable case involved General Dietrich von Choltitz, military commander of Paris, in August 1944. Hitler had ordered that the city not fall into enemy hands except as a field of ruins. Choltitz received detailed instructions to destroy monuments, bridges, industrial facilities and government buildings before the Allied arrival. The orders were clear and unequivocal, but Choltitz did not execute them. When the Allies entered Paris, the city was intact. Choltitz surrendered without implementing the ordered destruction. He later claimed that this was the moment he understood Hitler was insane. Although French historians have questioned this characterization as self-serving fantasy, the pattern was real. A similar pattern occurred in the Netherlands in late 1944. Hitler issued orders to implement a scorched earth policy. when it became obvious that the Allies would return to the country. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Reichskommissar in charge during the occupation, managed to significantly limit the scope of the execution of these orders. The destruction that ultimately occurred was much less than that contemplated in the original directives. Seyss-Inquart had found ways to delay, modify, and minimize the implementation of instructions he considered excessively destructive. The most significant example of high-level sabotage involved Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production. On March 19, 1945, Hitler issued the Nero Decree, an order demanding the destruction of all German infrastructure to prevent its use by Allied forces. The decree ordered the destruction of industrial facilities, power plants, transport networks, bridges, warehouses, and any other infrastructure useful to the enemy. The responsibility for executing this order fell upon Speer. According to his own testimony, Speer was horrified by the directive and lost faith in the Führer. He deliberately failed to comply with the order. Instead, he requested to be granted exclusive power to implement the plan, then used that authority to convince generals and Gauleiters to ignore the instructions. Hitler apparently remained ignorant of this disobedience until the end of the war. Speer claimed that during his last encounter with Hitler on April 22nd in the Berlin bunker, he admitted to having deliberately disobeyed. Hitler supposedly became furious, but allowed him to leave. However, Speer's account has been disputed by some historians, with Richard Evans describing it as pure invention. The exact veracity of Speer's claims is less important than the general pattern they illustrate. Even at the highest levels of the Nazi regime, some figures recognized the madness of total destruction policies and sought ways to mitigate their implementation. But these instances of disobedience were notable exceptions precisely because they were rare. The norm was obedience driven by a combination of intimidation, ideological fanaticism, personal loyalty to Hitler, and simple bureaucratic inertia. The majority of German generals continued executing irrational orders during the final months. Part of this obedience stemmed from fear of personal consequences, but part also came from a genuine loyalty to the regime and to Hitler personally. Contrary to the popular narrative influenced by the memoirs of surviving generals, many of Hitler's controversial decisions had some basis in reality and were not made on a whim. Hitler usually consulted with his subordinates before making important decisions. The no-retreat orders, although frequently disastrous, were not completely irrational from a certain strategic perspective. In a defensive war against numerically superior enemies, maintaining the initiative through local counterattacks could be preferable to constant retreats. This was the same reason Stalin ordered counterattacks in 1941 and 1942. The problem was not the underlying theory, but the fanatical application without considering specific tactical realities. Fortress cities were also not completely irrational as a concept. Some were garrisoned by second-line troops that might indeed have been lost in retreats. Forcing the enemy to divert resources to besiege them could generate some tactical value. The problem was the indiscriminate application to ill-prepared cities and the waste of frontline troops that could have been used more effectively. Until the end, Hitler and some followers maintained hopes of a miraculous change. These were not completely fanciful given European history. Germany invoked the precedent of the miracle of the House of Brandenburg of the 18th century, when the Russian Empress Elizabeth suddenly died and her successor took Russia out of the war against Prussia, saving Frederick the Great. Rumours that the Allied coalition might divide gave false hopes. Even in May 1945, some entertained fantastic ideas that Great Britain and the United States would switch sides and join Nazi Germany against Soviet Russia. The lower ranks of the German army remained surprisingly effective and motivated until very late. Private soldiers and junior officers were frequently convinced Nazis who considered the July 20th attack a disgrace. For them, fighting to the end was not the result of intimidation, but of genuine ideological conviction. They believed in the cause. They believed in Hitler. They believed that the iron will would eventually prevail. By March 1945, the German command structure had reached a state of almost total dysfunction. Hitler operated from his bunker in Berlin, increasingly isolated from reality. His orders were based on outdated maps and optimistic reports. Divisions that no longer existed were moved across these maps. Impossible counterattacks were ordered. The gap between the orders and operational reality widened constantly. The generals faced the impossible choice between executing suicidal orders or risking execution for disobedience. The German command system had transformed into a dysfunctional structure, paralyzed by intimidation, ideology, and denial of reality. But what specific orders sealed the fate of the Reich? What directives turned the final months of the war into a nightmare of self-inflicted destruction? During the last 6 months of the war, Hitler issued 3 types of directives that defined the final agony of the Third Reich. The first encompassed scorched earth policies that demanded the systematic destruction of German infrastructure. The second involved the forced mobilization of the civilian population through the Volkssturm. The third continued the creation of fortress cities that trapped soldiers and civilians in apocalyptic sieges. Together, these directives transformed the final months of the war into a nightmare of self-inflicted destruction. The Nero Decree of March 19th, 1945, represented the most extreme expression of the mentality of self-destruction that dominated Hitler's thinking. The order demanded the complete demolition of all infrastructure useful to enemy forces. Industrial facilities had to be dynamited, power plants rendered useless, railway networks destroyed, bridges blown up, warehouses burned, communication systems dismantled. The order allowed no exceptions based on civilian needs or possibilities for future reconstruction. The logic was brutally simple. If Germany could not win the war, it did not deserve to survive as a nation. Hitler had declared that Germany would be a world power or it would be nothing. This binary vision left no room for defeat followed by reconstruction. The German population had failed in its historical mission. Therefore, it did not deserve the basic tools of civilization. The survivors would have to face the consequences without infrastructure, without industry, without basic means of subsistence. If the war is lost, the people will also be lost, Hitler declared according to Speer's memoirs. It is not necessary to worry about what the German people will need for elementary survival. On the contrary, it is best to destroy even these things, for the nation has proven to be the weaker, and the future belongs solely to the stronger Eastern nation. In any case, only those who are inferior will remain after this struggle, for the good have already been killed. This was not the first time Hitler attempted to destroy unrecoverable territory. In Paris during August 1944, he had ordered that the city not fall except as a field of ruins. Specific instructions included the demolition of monuments, bridges over the Seine, government facilities, and industrial structures. Dietrich von Choltitz received these orders directly, but did not execute them. When Allied forces entered, they found Paris essentially intact. The Netherlands showed a similar pattern. At the end of 1944, Hitler ordered scorched earth. The dikes were to be destroyed, flooding territory, port facilities demolished, transport infrastructure rendered useless. But Arthur Seyss-Inquart managed to substantially limit the scope. Although there was some sabotage, the scale was much smaller than that contemplated in the original directives. The Nero Decree was different in ambition and scope. It was not a specific city, but a systematic order that covered the entire territory of the Reich that would be occupied. The destruction was to be total and methodical. Every major bridge, every power plant, every industrial facility, every railway junction. Complete implementation would have left Germany as an industrial wasteland incapable of sustaining its population. Albert Speer, as Minister of Armaments, faced the responsibility of executing this apocalyptic directive. He immediately understood that full implementation would condemn the civilian population to mass starvation and total collapse. Without power plants, Cities would be left without electricity. Without bridges, food transport would be impossible. Without railways, the distribution of supplies would cease. Without industrial infrastructure, reconstruction would be impossible for generations. The decree was a collective death sentence. Speer opted for systematic sabotage. He requested exclusive authority to implement the decree, then used that authority to convince generals and Gauleiters to ignore the instructions. He travelled personally organising passive resistance. He argued that the destruction was militarily unnecessary and civically catastrophic. Some commanders agreed and disobeyed discreetly. Others needed more persuasion. Some simply lacked the practical means to implement large-scale destruction. The result was irregular implementation. Some facilities were destroyed, particularly where fanatical SS officers supervised. Other places were saved by the quick action of local commanders. Some bridges were blown up, but many remained intact. Some industrial plants were sabotaged, but others continued operating until they were captured. The destruction that occurred was significant, but much less than what was contemplated. Hitler apparently remained ignorant of the sabotage until very late. According to Speer, during his last encounter in the bunker on April 22nd, he confessed to having deliberately disobeyed. Hitler supposedly became furious, but allowed Speer to leave. The veracity of this account has been questioned. Richard Evans describes it as pure invention, but Speer's narrative was important for his defense at Nuremberg. While scorched earth was irregularly implemented, another directive was transforming German society. On October 18th, 1944, Hitler formally established the Volkssturm, a national militia that would conscript all males between 16 and 60 years old who were not already serving in the Wehrmacht. The order framed this as the final national uprising against invading enemies after the failure of the Allies and 5 years of war. Heinrich Himmler was named Reichsführer of the Volkssturm. Responsible for organisation and training, tactical operations would fall under the Wehrmacht when units entered combat. The decree emphasised ideological commitment over professional military standards. Members had to swear unconditional obedience to Hitler and commit their lives to the defence of the Reich. Local Nazi party leaders would organise the units, ensuring that the militia remained under direct political control. The decision reflected personnel desperation. By the end of 1944, the Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses on both fronts. More than 3 million German soldiers had died or been incapacitated on the Eastern Front since 1941. The Soviet offensives of 1944, particularly Bagration, had destroyed entire divisions. The battles in the West, after Normandy, had bled forces dry. There simply were not enough men left to fill the gaps. The concept was inspired by the Prussian Landsturm of 1813 to 1815, which had fought against Napoleon as guerrilla forces. Plans to form a national militia were proposed by Guderian in 1944. The army lacked personnel to stop the Soviet onslaught, so additional categories were called up. Those in non-essential jobs, previously considered unfit, the elderly, miners, and those recovering from wounds. The basic unit was a battalion of 642 effectives, composed mostly of Hitler Youth members, the elderly, people with disabilities, and individuals previously unfit. Despite the effort of Bormann, who under Hitler's orders recruited almost 6 million, the intended force was never reached. In the end, approximately 700 battalions had been organised. Equipment was notoriously inadequate. Although there was an attempt to provide military uniforms, these did not reach everyone. Many wore improvised uniforms, or uniforms from their civilian jobs. The brown uniform of the Hitler Youth was common, creating confusion on the Eastern Front, where Soviet soldiers sometimes did not shoot them, thinking they were on their side. Weaponry was equally problematic. They received obsolete captured weapons or hastily manufactured ones. Some received World War I rifles. Others obtained weapons captured from French, Polish, and Czechoslovakian armies. Machine guns were scarce, artillery practically non-existent. The most effective weapon was the Panzerfaust, an anti-tank rocket launcher that required little skill and could effectively destroy tanks at short range. Training was minimal. Members were recruited from November 1944, but only 4 months later, the Red Army was entering East Prussia, and the Americans were crossing the Rhine. The advance required the Wehrmacht to urgently need all its experienced effectives at the front. Volkssturm recruits lacked appropriate instructors. Many had been World War I veterans with fundamental notions of military discipline, but teenagers and previously unfit males had little or no experience. Hitler and Himmler insisted on filling these militias with nationalist fanaticism to determine them to fight until their annihilation. For this reason, the Volkssturm did not operate under direct control of the Wehrmacht, but under the direction of the Nazi Party. This dual structure created constant confusion. Units technically fell under military authority in combat, but remained under political supervision at other times. Performance varied dramatically. On the Eastern Front, where soldiers feared Soviet reprisals and propaganda about Bolshevik atrocities resonated, units occasionally fought with determination. In Gumbinnen, East Prussia at the end of 1944, Volkssturm formations managed to temporarily halt the advance of the Red Army. When they were well positioned with Panzerfausts and commanded by experienced officers, they could inflict significant casualties. On the Western Front, performance was different. The indifference of the regular army and the belief that Western allies did not seek annihilation convinced many units to flee or surrender. In Remagen, when they saw the regular army retreat, they simply surrendered. Without competent leadership and commanded by party incompetence, these units disintegrated. The most extensive use occurred during the Battle of Berlin. Approximately 40,000 members, mainly youths between 13 and 18 years old and the elderly, were used to defend the capital. Between 20,000 and 40,000 military and civilian deaths occurred. The Volkssturm was sacrificed in street combat against an overwhelmingly superior enemy. Casualty rates revealed the fundamental brutality. During limited exposure, they suffered losses of 70 or 80%. In the East, approximately 650,000 saw action. Many perished. Others deserted when Nazi leaders fled. Units disintegrated when their political supervisors abandoned their posts. The third category of orders continued the policy of fortress cities. Throughout 1944 and early 1945, Hitler designated numerous cities as strongholds, to be defended to the last man. They were to allow themselves to be surrounded to immobilize enemy forces. In theory, they would have fulfilled a strategic function slowing the advance. In practice, they lacked the necessary fortifications, supplies, and preparation. Breslau became the most devastating example. Declared a fortress city on August 24, 1944, it was ordered to defend itself without retreat. The siege that began in February 1945 lasted 82 days, during which it suffered destruction that surpassed Berlin or Dresden. 200,000 civilians were trapped. By the time the garrison surrendered on May 6, 2/3 lay in ruins. Königsberg faced a similar fate. Designated an invincible bastion by Hitler, it was surrounded and besieged. Civilians who had not evacuated were trapped. Orders forbade preventative evacuations under the theory that civilian presence would raise morale. When it fell, it had been devastated. The pattern repeated itself in dozens of locations. Every fortress city became a death trap. Garrisons fought until ammunition ran out, then faced annihilation or surrender. Trapped civilians suffered terrible privations, constant bombardments, and frequently atrocities. The policy maximized suffering without achieving significant strategic gains. These three categories of orders, the Nero Decree, the Volkssturm, and the fortress cities, defined the final months. Together, they represented national self-destruction that prioritized ideological symbolism over human welfare. Full implementation would have turned Germany into a cemetery. That many were sabotaged or partially implemented, saved countless German lives, but could not alter the final result. But how did the generals respond to these impossible orders? What internal fractures did the final days of the Reich reveal? The relationship between Hitler and his generals during the last months was fundamentally dysfunctional. The orders emanating from the bunker reflected a disconnection with the reality of the battlefield. Military commanders faced an impossible dilemma: execute directives that would lead to the annihilation of their troops, or risk their lives through disobedience. The response of the German officer corps was varied, from fanatical obedience to deliberate sabotage and creative reinterpretation of impossible orders. The spectrum began with generals who executed every order without questioning it. These officers, products of years of Nazi indoctrination, or convinced that their survival depended on total conformity, implemented the most irrational directives with bureaucratic precision. When ordered to defend a city without strategic value to the last man, they organized that defense methodically. When instructed to hold an untenable line, they positioned their troops and awaited inevitable annihilation. They had internalized the logic that iron will could compensate for material disadvantages, or simply decided that blind obedience was their only option. At the opposite extreme were officers who opted for forms of active or passive resistance. They recognized that the orders were militarily absurd and morally indefensible. Some sought ways to discreetly sabotage the implementation of particularly destructive directives. Others reinterpreted orders, preserving some margin for tactical rationality. A few disobeyed openly, although this option was extremely dangerous. Between these extremes existed a considerable grey area where the majority operated. These commanders had learned the art of appearing to obey while subtly modifying the implementation. A general could receive instructions to hold a position at all costs, but interpreted this as holding until further resistance only resulted in losses without benefit. Another commander might receive orders to defend every metre, but implemented night withdrawals that technically maintained contact while preserving combat capability. This reinterpretation required considerable political skill, in addition to military competence. The generals had to write reports that described their actions consistently with the received orders, even when reality had been different. They had to use ambiguous language that satisfied fanatical supervisors while leaving room for rational decisions. They had to demonstrate sufficient public loyalty to avoid suspicion while secretly prioritizing force preservation and civilian protection. General Gotthard Heinriche illustrates this type of pragmatic commander. Heinrichi developed a reputation as a master of defensive warfare, skilled at extracting maximum benefit from positions while preserving forces. When he assumed command of Army Group Vistula in March 1945, he inherited a desperate situation. He received explicit orders to hold every position and defend Berlin to the last man, but he understood that static resistance guaranteed annihilation without slowing the Soviet advance. Heinrichi implemented a flexible defensive strategy that violated the spirit of the orders, while technically maintaining their letter. He identified real defensive lines and secretly evacuated frontline positions that would be bombarded. When the April 16th offensive began, the bombardment fell on empty trenches. German forces in secondary lines met the assault from more favourable positions. This tactic could not stop the advance, but it maximized enemy casualties while preserving German forces. Heinrichi's actions eventually attracted Hitler's attention. On April 28th, Hitler ordered his dismissal for supposedly retreating without authorization. But by then the command system was so disintegrated that the order had little effect. Heinrichi continued directing operations while Berlin fell. His case illustrates both the possibilities and the limits of tactical disobedience. Another example involved General Theodor Busse, commander of the Ninth Army, facing the Soviet offensive from the Oder. Busse received orders to hold positions and then counterattack toward Berlin to break the Soviet encirclement. These orders were operationally impossible. The Ninth Army was surrounded, short of ammunition and fuel, facing overwhelmingly superior forces. Busch chose to ignore the orders. Instead, he organized an attempt to break the encirclement to the west to reach American lines. This movement saved tens of thousands of soldiers from death or Soviet capture. Technically, it constituted direct disobedience. But by late April, Hitler's control over his armies was more nominal than real. Communications were broken. The chain of command had disintegrated. Generals made decisions based on immediate tactical realities. The fortress cities provided another context where commanders faced terrible decisions between obedience and humanity. Designated commanders knew that the orders were death sentences for their garrisons and civilian populations. Some executed the orders to the letter, organizing fanatical defenses that ended in massacres. Others sought ways to mitigate the disaster. General Hermann Niehoff, commander of Breslau, chose to execute his orders with Prussian determination. He organized a meticulous defense that lasted 82 days. During that time, Breslau was reduced to rubble. The civilian population suffered indescribable horrors. Niehoff did not surrender until May 6th, 2 days after the surrender of Berlin. By then, 2/3 of the city had been destroyed. The defense had achieved no significant strategic objective, but Niehoff had obeyed. Other fortress commanders sought to limit the disaster. Some secretly facilitated the evacuation of civilians, despite explicit prohibitions. Others negotiated surrenders when the situation became untenable. A few abandoned positions when it became clear that resistance would only cause more suffering without benefit. The ethical dilemma was genuine and terrible. On one hand, they had sworn loyalty to Hitler. The Prussian military tradition emphasized obedience and duty fulfillment. Disobeying orders constituted treason according to traditional standards. On the other hand, these commanders had responsibilities toward their troops and civilians. Executing orders that guaranteed death without strategic purpose violated other principles of professional military conduct. The response of each commander depended on multiple factors: his ideological commitment to Nazism, his evaluation of personal consequences of disobedience, his sense of responsibility, his judgment of tactical realities, and his personal character. There was no simple correct answer. Each option involved significant moral costs. The civilian population added another dimension. By mid-1945, most civilians had lost faith in victory. Bombardments had destroyed cities. Casualty lists had devastated families. Shortages created real privation. Propaganda about miracle weapons sounded absurd facing enemy armies occupying territory. Civilians wanted the war to end, but the regime had created an atmosphere of intimidation that kept the population submissive. Public executions of defeatists served as warnings. Gestapo agents continued operating. Nazi party leaders exercised tyrannical control. Expressing a desire for surrender could result in execution. Hanging a white flag could lead to public hanging. This atmosphere meant that even commanders who wanted to minimize civilian suffering faced resistance from party authorities. A general attempting to evacuate civilians could be blocked by the local Gauleiter. A commander considering surrender could be denounced by political commissars. The Nazi structure created mutual surveillance that made humanitarian action difficult. The case of Cologne illustrates these dynamics. When American forces approached in March 1945, the Gauleiter insisted on fanatical defense. The military commander recognized that defending the city would only cause more suffering without benefit, but lacked authority to override the Gauleiter. The result was destructive combat that further devastated the city. Thousands of civilians were trapped. Many perished. The defense delayed the advance only a few days at a terrible human cost. The contrast between Eastern and Western fronts also affected decisions. In the East, soldiers faced genuine fear of Soviet capture. Propaganda about atrocities contained enough truth to be convincing. German soldiers had witnessed or participated in massive crimes against Soviet populations during the invasion. They knew they had burned villages, executed prisoners, and participated in genocidal policies. They feared justified revenge. This fear turned into defensive fanaticism that prolonged the agony. Battles in the east during the early months of 1945 were particularly bloody. When the Red Army launched its massive winter offensive on January 12th, German forces were outnumbered in ratios of 5 or 6 to 1. Soviet superiority in artillery, tanks, and self-propelled artillery was equally overwhelming, but German units continued fighting fiercely, even when surrounded and cut off from supplies. Hitler's orders to hold every position ensured that these units were annihilated instead of retreating to fight another day. The result was a constant drain of the best remaining German units. Divisions that could have been preserved through tactical retreats were destroyed defending positions without strategic value. Veteran soldiers who had survived years of combat died in meaningless battles. Young replacements with minimal training were sent to the front and annihilated in days. The German replacement system could not keep pace with the losses. German divisions operated with fractions of their nominal strength. Battalions that should have had 800 effectives had 200. The logistical collapse amplified the disaster. German supply networks disintegrated completely during the last months. Frontline units lacked ammunition, fuel, food, and basic medical equipment. Soldiers fought with inadequate rations. The wounded died for lack of medical treatment. Vehicles were abandoned for lack of fuel. Artillery fell silent due to shortage of shells. Armoured units transformed into immobile metal boxes when fuel ran out. This logistical collapse was not inevitable. Germany still possessed significant industrial resources in early 1945. The problem was that these resources could not be transported effectively to the front. Allied bombings had destroyed railway networks. Bridges over major rivers had been brought down. Highways were congested with columns of civilian refugees fleeing west. The German transport system had collapsed under the combined pressure of strategic bombings and impossible operational demands. But what did all this mean for the individual soldiers trapped in this machinery of destruction? How did those who executed or suffered these final orders experience the last weeks? The fortress cities illustrated the human consequences of Hitler's orders in their crudest form. Breslau suffered 82 days of siege that reduced the city to ruins. The trapped civilian population faced starvation, constant bombardments, and street combat. The garrison soldiers fought without hope of relief or victory. When they finally surrendered on May 6th, they had held out 2 days longer than Berlin. This prolonged resistance achieved no strategic objective. It did not significantly divert Soviet forces from the main advance. It simply caused more death and destruction without purpose. Königsberg faced a similar fate. Civilians who had not evacuated in time were trapped. When the Soviet encirclement closed, Hitler's orders forbade preventative evacuations, under the theory that civilian presence would raise the morale of the defenders. In reality, the trapped civilians simply added mouths to feed in a besieged city with limited supplies. When Königsberg finally fell after a brutal siege, the civilian population had suffered privations that rivaled anything experienced during the war. The late evacuation of Germany's eastern regions was another catastrophic consequence of Hitler's policies. Regional Nazi leaders had received implicit instructions to keep civilian populations in place until the last possible moment. Evacuating prematurely implied defeatism and lack of faith in the defense. As a result, millions of German civilians remained in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia until the Red Army was literally at the gates. When they finally fled, they did so in horrific winter conditions, with refugee columns being bombarded by Soviet planes and attacked by ground troops. The temperature dropped far below zero. The roads were covered in ice. The elderly and small children succumbed to the cold during night marches. Mothers carried frozen babies for kilometers before accepting they had died. Operation Hannibal, the massive naval evacuation of German civilians and soldiers from Baltic ports, was the largest rescue operation of the Second World War. Between January and May 1945, the German Navy evacuated between 1 and 2 million people across the Baltic, far surpassing the scale of the famous Dunkirk rescue. This operation succeeded only because Admiral Karl Dönitz deliberately disobeyed Hitler's orders not to withdraw troops from the Baltic pockets. If Dönitz had followed instructions to the letter, those millions of people would have been trapped and likely killed or captured. The suffering of German civilians was exacerbated by the policies of the Nazi regime itself. Regional party leaders, who had insisted on keeping populations in place, frequently fled at the last moment, abandoning civilians to their fate. These Nazi officials secured their own evacuation, while the populations they had forced to stay faced the arrival of the Red Army, without leadership or organization. Soviet atrocities against the German civilian population during the occupation of eastern regions were systematic and massive. Rapes were particularly widespread, with victim estimates reaching hundreds of thousands. These atrocities were partially revenge for German crimes committed in Soviet territory, partially the result of discipline collapse in advancing Soviet units, and partially a deliberate policy to terrorize the German population. But was the Western Front different? Did German soldiers and civilians encounter a distinct fate when facing Americans and British? On the Western Front, the consequences were less catastrophic, but still significant. German civilians in the West were generally treated better by American and British occupation forces, but Hitler's insistence on defending every town and every city still caused massive destruction and unnecessary civilian losses. The Volkssturm was sacrificed in these final urban battles. Elderly men and teenagers with minimal training were sent to fight against professional troops with superior weaponry. Casualty rates were predictably horrendous. In some battles, 70 or 80% of Volkssturm units were annihilated. These were not professional soldiers dying in combat, but forcefully conscripted civilians sent into hopeless battles. The Battle of Berlin represented the climax of this disaster. Approximately 40,000 members of the Volkssturm, mainly youths between 13 and 18 years old and the elderly, were used to defend the capital. They fought alongside remnants of Wehrmacht units against Free Soviet armies, totaling more than 2 million soldiers. The result was inevitable from the beginning. Between 20,000 and 40,000 military and civilian deaths occurred during the battle. Large areas of the city were reduced to rubble. Smoke from fires darkened the sky for days. Corpses piled up in the streets because no one could collect them under constant fire. Overwhelmed hospitals operated without anesthesia, without medicines, without hope. Even the last week of the war was tremendously costly. After Hitler's suicide on April 30th, Admiral Dönitz assumed power as successor and continued the fight for 8 additional days. Between May 1st and May 8th, 1945, 220,000 German soldiers were captured by the Red Army. 1,600,000 were captured by Western forces during the same period. These soldiers could have been saved by immediate surrender after Hitler's death. The long-term impact of these final months was devastating for Germany. Cities reduced to rubble would require decades to rebuild. Destroyed industrial infrastructure severely limited post-war economic capacity. The loss of millions of working-age males created demographic imbalances that lasted generations. Hitler's final orders not only caused massive suffering, but also enormously complicated post-war reconstruction. Every city that resisted until being reduced to ruins required almost total reconstruction. But what was happening inside the bunker while millions died above? What orders were coming out of those subterranean rooms during the final weeks? During the last weeks of April 1945, Adolf Hitler directed the defense of Germany from a subterranean bunker located beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. This reinforced concrete complex, built 9 meters underground, had become the command center of an empire that no longer existed. From these narrow and damp rooms, permanently illuminated by artificial light, Hitler issued his final orders to armies that had ceased to exist. moved phantom divisions over outdated maps, and planned counter-offensives with forces that would never arrive. The contrast between the grandiosity of his plans and the misery of his situation perfectly encapsulated the total bankruptcy of the Nazi regime. Hitler's progressive isolation from reality had begun long before his final descent into the bunker. For years, his inner circle had learned that reporting bad news led to outbursts of fury and accusations of defeatism. Generals and officers who objectively reported desperate situations were accused of cowardice or treason. As a result, the flow of information to Hitler became increasingly distorted. Subordinates learned to present news in the least provocative way possible, emphasizing any positive development, no matter how marginal, and minimizing obvious disasters. By April 1945, this systematic distortion of reality had reached grotesque proportions. Hitler operated with maps that showed units that had been destroyed weeks earlier. He believed that divisions existing only on paper were still effective combat forces. He planned movements of armies that had no fuel to move, ammunition to fight, nor will to obey. The gap between what Hitler believed was happening and what was actually occurring on the battlefield had widened into an unbridgeable abyss. The orders issued from the bunker during these final days reflected this complete disconnection from reality. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, the Red Army launched its final offensive against Berlin. 2 Soviet fronts with more than 2 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 40,000 artillery pieces converged on the German capital from the north and the south. The German forces defending the city consisted of shattered remnants of Wehrmacht units, increasingly desperate SS formations, and approximately 40,000 members of the Volkssturm. The disproportion was so obvious that even the most fanatical Nazis recognized that the fall of Berlin was only a matter of days. But Hitler refused to accept this reality. On April 21st, he ordered the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, commanded by Felix Steiner, to launch a massive counterattack against the flank of the Soviet advance. This order completely ignored the fact that Steiner's so-called corps was merely an ad hoc combat group formed by remnants of destroyed units, military academy cadets, and maintenance personnel hastily converted into infantry. He did not possess the force, equipment, nor logistical support necessary to execute a significant counterattack, much less stop 2 entire Soviet fronts. Steiner, an experienced commander, who perfectly understood the impossibility of the order, simply did not execute it. He did not have the means to fulfill it, and recognized that attempting it would only cause the meaningless annihilation of the forces under his command. When Hitler discovered that the counterattack had not materialized, he suffered an emotional collapse that several witnesses described as the most severe of the entire war. He shouted that he had been betrayed by everyone, that the generals were incompetent and cowards, that the German people had proven unworthy of his leadership. This outburst marked the moment when Hitler apparently accepted that the war was lost. But even after this collapse, Hitler continued issuing orders that bore no connection to operational reality. On April 22nd, he ordered the 12th Army of General Walter Wenck, positioned on the Western Front near the Elbe River, to abandon its defensive position against the Americans and march east to relieve Berlin. This order required the 12th Army to turn its back on an enemy, march more than 100 kilometers through partially occupied territory, break the Soviet lines encircling Berlin, and then fight its way to the center of the city. All this without air superiority, with inadequate supplies, and against an overwhelmingly superior enemy in numbers. Wenck, like Steiner, recognized the impossibility of the mission. But unlike Steiner, Wenck made a genuine attempt to partially fulfill the order, not because he believed he could save Berlin, but because he understood that an advance eastward could open an escape corridor for German civilians and soldiers trying to flee from Soviet vengeance. The 12th Army advanced eastward and even managed to establish contact with remnants of the 9th Army trying to break the Soviet encirclement. but it never had a real chance of reaching Berlin. By late April, Wenck's advance had stalled, and his forces were being pushed back west. Simultaneously, Hitler ordered the 9th Army of General Theodor Bürster to abandon its position southeast of Berlin and counterattack toward the capital. This order ignored that the 9th Army was completely surrounded by Soviet forces, short of ammunition and fuel, and simply fighting to survive. Bürster, facing the choice between obeying a suicidal order or saving what was left of his forces, opted for the latter. Instead of counterattacking toward Berlin, he organised a desperate attempt to break the Soviet encirclement westward, to link up with Wenck's 12th Army and eventually reach American lines. This direct disobedience illustrated how Hitler's control over his armies had completely collapsed. Communications between the bunker and field units were intermittent. Orders issued from Berlin frequently did not reach their recipients. When they did, field commanders evaluated them according to their own assessment of the tactical reality, and frequently opted to ignore them. The centralized command system that Hitler had meticulously built over the years had disintegrated into decentralized chaos, where each commander acted according to his own judgment. But what atmosphere reigned inside the bunker while the world crumbled outside? What conversations took place in those claustrophobic rooms during the final days? Inside the bunker, the atmosphere became increasingly surreal. Hitler spent hours studying maps of Berlin, planning the defense street by street. He argued with his generals over the best way to employ divisions that no longer existed. He expressed confidence that German miracle weapons would turn the tide of the battle. He alternated between manic optimism about imminent victories and deep depression over betrayal and failure. Constant Soviet bombardment regularly shook the bunker, interrupting meetings and sending cascades of concrete dust from the ceiling. The bunker staff observed this spectacle with a mixture of persistent loyalty, incredulity, and growing despair. Some fanatical Nazis like Joseph Goebbels remained completely committed until the end, proclaiming they would fight to the death in the ruins of Berlin. Others like Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler silently began to explore personal survival options, contacts with the Western Allies, and possible peace negotiations. When Hitler discovered these betrayals during his final days, he reacted with fury, but he already lacked the power to effectively punish his former lieutenants. On April 28th, Hitler learned that Himmler had been trying to negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies through Swedish intermediaries. This betrayal by the Reichsführer SS, the individual Hitler referred to as Der treue Heinrich, or Loyal Heinrich, was perhaps the most emotionally devastating blow of all. Hitler had tolerated Himmler's incompetence as a military commander because he implicitly trusted his personal loyalty. Discovering that even Himmler had abandoned him seemed to break something fundamental in Hitler. He ordered Himmler to be arrested and executed, but the order could not be carried out because Himmler had already fled Berlin. On April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony in the bunker. That same night, he dictated his political and personal testament. In these final documents, Hitler expressed no remorse for the policies that had led Germany to disaster. Instead, he blamed the Jews for starting the war, accused his generals of treason and incompetence, and urged the German people to continue the fight against international Jewry. He designated Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as head of state and Joseph Goebbels as the new Reich Chancellor. On April 30th, 1945, while Soviet forces fought less than 500 meters from the Chancellery, Hitler committed suicide along with Eva Braun. Their bodies were carried to the Chancellery garden, doused with gasoline, and partially incinerated. The remains were hastily buried in a bomb crater. The next day, Joseph Goebbels, who had been appointed Chancellor mere hours earlier, also committed suicide, along with his wife Magda, after poisoning their 6 children. The leadership structure of the Third Reich had literally self-destructed. Dönitz, operating from Flensburg near the Danish border, attempted for 8 more days to selectively continue the war, surrendering forces to the Westerners, while still fighting the Soviets. The Allies rejected this strategy and demanded unconditional surrender on all fronts simultaneously. On May 7th, General Alfred Jodl signed the German military surrender in Reims. On May 8th, Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed a second surrender in Berlin before Soviet authorities. The war in Europe had finally ended. Hitler's final orders from the bunker had been as useless as they were predictable. They did not save Berlin. They did not stop the Soviets. They did not change the outcome of the war. They only prolonged the agony, caused more meaningless deaths, and added another layer of suffering to an already immeasurable tragedy. The contrast between the omnipotence Hitler had exercised for years and his total impotence during the final weeks perfectly illustrated the complete collapse of the Nazi regime. But what lessons can be drawn from this catastrophe? What does the history of the final orders teach us about the natures of power, obedience, and individual responsibility? Statistics tell part of the story, but only part. Between July 1944 and May 1945, more German civilians died than in all previous years of the conflict combined. More than 400,000 perished from Allied bombings. Up to 500,000 additional civilian deaths occurred as a result of the Soviet invasion and occupation of Germany's eastern regions, accompanied by mass rapes and atrocities. In the military realm, the numbers are equally devastating. 49% of all German military deaths in the Second World War occurred during the final 10 months of the conflict. Almost half of all German soldiers who died in 6 years of war perished after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler of July 20th, 1944. These figures reflect a brutal reality. Hitler's orders to resist until total annihilation exponentially multiplied human suffering without altering the final outcome of the war. If the attack on Hitler had succeeded and the war had ended in 1944, the lives of approximately half of the German soldiers who died could have been saved. The hundreds of thousands of civilians who perished during the final months would also have survived. The cities that were reduced to rubble in 1945 would have remained relatively intact. Post-war reconstruction would have been infinitely less difficult. But beyond statistics, the story of the final orders raises fundamental questions about human responsibility in times of crisis. To what extent are the generals who executed obviously suicidal orders responsible for the resulting deaths? Can the threat of personal execution justify the transmission of collective death sentences? Where does legitimate obedience end and criminal complicity begin? The answers are not simple. Some generals chose blind obedience, whether through ideological conviction, personal fear, or inability to imagine alternatives. Others found ways to resist passively, reinterpreting orders to minimize damage, while maintaining enough appearance of compliance to survive. A few disobeyed openly and paid with their lives or their careers. The case of Dietrich von Choltitz in Paris, of Albert Speer with the Nero Decree, of Karl Dönitz with the Baltic evacuations, of Gottfried Heinrici with flexible defences, demonstrates that disobedience was possible even within the Nazi system. That many chose not to exercise that option reflects not only fear, but also institutional inertia, personal loyalty, and in many cases, genuine ideological sympathy. The final tragedy of Hitler's orders is that they were executed by a system designed to execute them. The Nazi regime had spent years building structures that rewarded absolute obedience and punished any questioning. The purges after July 20th eliminated the last vestiges of potential resistance. The climate of intimidation ensured that even those who recognized the madness of the orders feared the consequences of expressing doubts. The result was a machinery of death that continued functioning long after its original purpose had disappeared. Soldiers continued fighting because they were afraid not to fight. Generals transmitted impossible orders because they were afraid not to transmit them. Civilians remained in doomed cities because they were afraid to evacuate without authorization. Fear, not hope, kept the system running until the end. But did other factors beyond fear exist? What role did ideology play in prolonging the catastrophe? To fully understand Hitler's final orders, it is necessary to understand the belief system that sustained them. Hitler did not simply issue irrational military orders out of whim or insanity. His decisions were grounded in a coherent, albeit profoundly distorted worldview that saw the war as an existential struggle between races where the very survival of the German nation was at stake. In this worldview, surrender was not simply an unfavourable tactical option, but a racial betrayal that would condemn future generations. Resistance to the death was not irrational fanaticism, but the only course of action compatible with the fundamental principles of National Socialism. If Germany could not dominate, then it had to perish. No acceptable middle ground existed. This binary logic explains both the orders of absolute resistance and the Nero decree of total destruction. For Hitler, a defeated Germany had proven its racial unworthiness. The survivors would be, by definition, the weakest elements of the population. They did not deserve the tools of civilization. The destruction of infrastructure was not revenge against his own people, but the logical recognition that this people had failed in their historical mission. This vision found an echo at many levels of the regime. Not all Nazis shared Hitler's philosophical elaborations, but many had internalized the basic premise that the war was total and existential. For them, surrender equaled extermination. The atrocities they had committed or witnessed in the East reinforced this belief. They knew that their actions had been criminal by any conventional standard. They feared, with considerable reason, the consequences of falling into the hands of those they had brutalized. This fear became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Nazi policies of extermination in the East guaranteed that the final resistance would be particularly fierce on that front. German soldiers who had participated in massacres of Soviet civilians or witnessed the extermination camps knew they could expect no mercy. They preferred to die fighting than face Soviet justice. Officers who had supervised atrocities recognized that surrender would mean trial and execution. They continued fighting not out of hope for victory, but out of fear of the alternatives. This dynamic created a vicious cycle where crimes of the past motivated present resistance, which in turn produced more suffering and fueled more crimes. But what did ordinary soldiers caught in this spiral think? Did they share the convictions of their leaders, or simply obey for lack of alternatives? Evidence suggests a complex mixture of factors. Many German soldiers, especially the youngest, had been completely socialized within the Nazi system. They knew no other reality. The propaganda they had absorbed since childhood had taught them that Jews were existential enemies, that Slavs were subhuman, that Germany was destined to dominate or perish. For these youths, Nazi ideology was not an external imposition, but an integral part of their identity. They fought to the end, not primarily out of fear, but out of genuine conviction. Other soldiers, especially older veterans, who remembered pre-Hitler Germany, were more skeptical. They had seen too much to believe in miraculous victories. They recognized that propaganda was propaganda. They continued fighting for more prosaic reasons: loyalty to comrades, fear of consequences, simple inertia, inability to imagine how to end something that seemed destined to continue indefinitely. A frequently underestimated factor was camaraderie. Bonds forged in combat created obligations that transcended ideology or strategy. A soldier could doubt Hitler, despise the Nazis, and recognize the war was lost, but still continue fighting, because quitting meant betraying his comrades, who depended on him. This horizontal loyalty toward peers frequently outweighed vertical loyalty to the chain of command. Peer pressure kept many units cohesive long after any strategic justification had disappeared. How does the behaviour of German generals compare with that of their counterparts in other nations and conflicts? Was extreme obedience a uniquely Nazi phenomenon, or does it reflect more universal patterns? The question of military obedience to immoral or irrational orders is not limited to the Third Reich. Throughout history, armies of all nations have faced situations where commanders had to choose between obeying superior orders and exercising independent moral judgment. The results have varied enormously depending on specific circumstances, the military traditions involved, and the personalities of the individuals involved. The Prussian military tradition that shaped the majority of German officers emphasized obedience as the supreme virtue. Frederick the Great's famous dictum that soldiers must fear their own officers more than the enemy reflected a philosophy where rigid discipline was considered essential for military effectiveness. This tradition produced remarkably efficient armies, but it also created a culture where questioning orders was seen as anathema. The German officers of 1944 to 1945 were products of this tradition, amplified by years of Nazi indoctrination. Many had sworn a personal oath of loyalty to Hitler, not simply to the German state. This personal oath created obligations that transcended conventional military considerations. Breaking the oath meant personal dishonor, in addition to legal consequences. The contrast with other armies is instructive. American and British forces operated under traditions that permitted, even encouraged, greater individual initiative. Officers were trained to question orders that seemed counterproductive or illegal. The chain of command was respected but not sacralized. Field commanders had considerable discretion to adapt instructions to local circumstances. The Soviet Red Army presented an intermediate case. Stalin had executed thousands of officers during the purges of the 1930s, creating a culture of fear similar to the Nazi one. But after the initial disasters of 1941, Stalin gradually allowed greater tactical flexibility to his commanders. Generals like Zhukov and Konev operated with considerable operational autonomy, although always under the shadow of possible consequences for failure. Differences in military traditions produced differences in behavior during the final months of the war. Soviet commanders executed aggressive orders with fierce determination, but they also received adequate resources to fulfill them. Western Allied commanders adjusted plans according to tactical developments without fear of reprisal. German commanders frequently recognized that the orders they received were impossible, but lacked institutional mechanisms to express objections or propose alternatives. The Nazi system had deliberately eliminated all channels of negative feedback. Officers who reported problems were seen as defeatists. Generals who proposed retreats were replaced by fanatics, willing to execute any order. Information flowing to Hitler was systematically distorted to avoid provoking his fury. The result was a cycle of decisions increasingly disconnected from reality, executed by officers increasingly incapable of influencing them. This pattern offers lessons relevant beyond the specific historical context. Any organization that systematically punishes bad news will eventually lose contact with reality. Any system that rewards blind obedience over informed judgment will eventually produce catastrophic decisions. Any command structure that eliminates the possibility of legitimate dissent will eventually become incapable of correcting its own mistakes. Hitler's final orders were not aberrations produced by an insane leader. They were the logical products of a system designed to produce them. What happened to the generals who survived? How did they process their participation in the catastrophe? What narratives did they construct to explain their actions? The post-war period saw the emergence of what historians have called the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. According to this narrative, actively propagated by surviving German generals, the Wehrmacht had been a professional military force that fought with distinction, while the SS and other elements of the Nazi Party committed atrocities. The generals had obeyed legitimate orders, while attempting to moderate the excesses of the regime. The blame for war crimes rested exclusively on Hitler and his immediate circle. This narrative was convenient for multiple parties. German generals used it to rehabilitate their reputations and avoid legal consequences. Western powers accepted it because they needed German military experience during the emerging Cold War. The new Federal Republic of Germany promoted it because it facilitated the reintegration of veterans into civil society. But the narrative was fundamentally false. Subsequent historical research extensively demonstrated that the Wehrmacht had actively participated in war crimes, including massacres of prisoners, executions of civilians, and cooperation with Holocaust operations. The generals who later claimed ignorance or impotence had frequently issued orders that facilitated atrocities, or simply looked the other way while they occurred. Post-war memoirs written by German generals reflect this systematic distortion. Figures like Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, and others produced accounts that emphasized their military professionalism while minimizing or completely ignoring their complicity with crimes. They presented Hitler as a madman who had ruined brilliant operations with amateur interference. They positioned themselves as victims of a system they had not chosen to serve. The case of Albert Speer is particularly illustrative. Speer carefully constructed an image of himself as the good Nazi, the apolitical technocrat who had tried to save Germany from Hitler's most destructive orders. His narrative of having sabotaged the Nero decree earned him some public rehabilitation. He was sentenced to 20 years at Nuremberg, a relatively light sentence considering his position. But later investigations revealed that Speer had been much more involved in crimes than he admitted. He had supervised forced labour programs that killed thousands. He had known the conditions in the concentration camps that supplied workers to his construction projects. His claims of ignorance regarding the Holocaust were contradicted by documentary evidence. Speer's narrative, like those of many other surviving generals, was a construction designed for personal survival, rather than an honest recounting of the facts. But were there exceptions? Were there generals who fully acknowledged their responsibility? A few. General Hans Friesner, who had commanded on the Eastern Front, wrote memoirs that more openly acknowledged the moral difficulties he had faced. General Johannes Blaskowitz, who had formally protested against atrocities in Poland in 1939, maintained a cleaner record, although his protests had not managed to stop the crimes. But these cases were exceptions. The majority of surviving generals constructed narratives that absolved them of responsibility while blaming Hitler, the SS, or circumstances beyond their control. These narratives dominated public understanding of the war for decades, before more critical investigations began to challenge them. The process of confronting the Nazi past was long and painful for German society. The first post-war generation frequently opted for silence, a tacit conspiracy not to look too closely at what had happened and who had been responsible. Veterans kept their experiences to themselves. Families did not ask what their fathers had done during the war. It was only with the passing of decades that a more honest confrontation began to emerge. War crimes trials continued sporadically for years. Historical research gradually demolished the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. New generations began to ask the uncomfortable questions their parents had avoided. This process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past, became a central element of post-war German identity. What relevance does this history hold for the contemporary world? What lessons can be drawn from the catastrophe of the final orders? The first lesson concerns the dangers of authoritarian leadership disconnected from reality. Hitler, in his final months, represents the extreme case of a leader surrounded by sycophants, who tell him what he wants to hear, isolated from accurate information about real conditions, convinced that personal will can overcome objective material limitations. This pattern is not unique to Nazism. Authoritarian leaders of all political stripes have fallen into similar traps. The tendency to punish bearers of bad news, to promote loyal subordinates over competent ones, to interpret any criticism as disloyalty. These behaviours inevitably produce decisions disconnected from reality. Institutions that allow negative feedback, that protect those who express legitimate doubts, that value accurate information over comfortable conformity. These institutions are essential to prevent similar catastrophes. The second lesson concerns the limits and obligations of obedience. The Nuremberg trials established the principle that following orders is not a sufficient defense for war crimes. Individuals retain moral responsibility for their actions, even when acting under superior instructions. This principle has been incorporated into international law and modern military codes, but practical application remains complex. When exactly must a subordinate disobey? What level of certainty about the illegality or immorality of an order is necessary? What personal consequences are reasonable to expect someone to accept on principle? The cases of German generals who disobeyed, partially or completely, demonstrate that resistance was possible. Choltitz saved Paris. Speer, regardless of the exact veracity of his claims, at least tried to limit destruction. Dönitz saved millions of lives with the Baltic evacuations. Heinrici preserved forces through flexible tactics, but they also demonstrate the costs and risks of disobedience. Many officers who questioned orders were dismissed, arrested, or executed. The Nazi system was specifically designed to eliminate the possibility of organized resistance. Individual disobedience was possible but dangerous. Collective resistance had been effectively prevented by the post-July 20 purges. The third lesson concerns the importance of institutions that limit power. The Nazi system had systematically eliminated all institutional counterweights to Hitler's power. The parliament was a facade. The courts applied racist laws. The press propagated official lies. The army had been subordinated to the party. The churches had been neutralized or co-opted. In the absence of independent institutions, there were no legitimate mechanisms to question catastrophic decisions. Modern democracies maintain separation of powers, freedom of the press, judicial independence, and other mechanisms precisely to prevent the concentration of authority that permitted Hitler's final orders. When these mechanisms erode, when leaders attack the independent press, politicize the courts, delegitimize the opposition, the risks of similar catastrophes increase. The fourth lesson concerns the fragility of civilization. Germany in 1933 was one of the most educated, industrialized, and culturally sophisticated societies in the world. It possessed prestigious universities, profound philosophical traditions, extraordinary scientific achievements. None of this prevented the descent into barbarism. In barely 12 years, this advanced society produced the Holocaust, a war of racial conquest and systematic destruction that killed tens of millions. Hitler's final orders were the logical conclusion of premises accepted years earlier: the dehumanization of entire groups of people, the glorification of violence, the cult of the infallible leader, the subordination of all values to the nation. These ideas, when allowed to flourish without resistance, inevitably produce monstrous results. Constant vigilance against such ideas, even when they appear in seemingly harmless forms, is essential to prevent their development toward catastrophic consequences. What memories do the places where these orders were executed preserve? What physical traces remain of those final days? The bunker where Hitler spent his final days no longer exists in its original form. After the war, Soviet authorities tried to destroy it, but the reinforced concrete construction resisted multiple demolition attempts. Eventually, it was partially excavated and filled in. Today, the site is marked only by a discrete information panel in an ordinary parking lot in the center of Berlin. This deliberate absence of monumentalization reflects the German ambivalence toward Nazi memory. Unlike other historical sites, there is no museum dedicated to the Führer's bunker. Authorities have resisted proposals to excavate it or turn it into a tourist attraction. The concern is that any preservation could become a place of pilgrimage for neo-Nazi sympathizers. The fortress cities that suffered massive destruction were rebuilt in various ways. Breslau, now Wrocław in Poland, was completely rebuilt after the war. The old town was meticulously restored, albeit with a completely different population. The Germans who survived the siege were expelled during post-war population exchanges. The current city is Polish, inhabited by people without direct connection to the tragedy of 1945. Königsberg, now Kaliningrad in Russia, presents a different case. The city remained a Russian exclave after European borders were redrawn. The German Old Town was almost completely demolished during the Soviet era, replaced by Stalinist constructions. Little remains physically of the city that resisted and fell in 1945. Berlin shows its scars more visibly. Although reconstruction has transformed the city, certain sites preserve memory of the final days. The Brandenburg Gate, scene of fierce fighting, was restored. The Reichstag, burned and bombed, was rebuilt with a modern glass dome that symbolizes democratic transparency. The graffiti of Soviet soldiers was deliberately preserved on the interior walls as a reminder. Holocaust memorials occupy prominent places in the Berlin urban landscape. The Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, with its 2,711 concrete blocks, extends near the bunker site. The topography of terror documents the regime's crimes in the place where the Gestapo and SS headquarters stood. The memorial to the German resistance remembers those who tried to oppose it. These memorials represent the contemporary German commitment to memory and responsibility. They do not celebrate the Nazi past, but confront it directly, acknowledging the crimes committed and remembering the victims. This approach, developed over decades of public debate, has made Germany an example of how societies can process traumatic pasts. But memory is always contested. New political movements question the established memory culture. Some argue that Germany has sufficiently processed its past and should move on from its obsession with Nazism. Others point out that each generation must confront these questions anew, that memory cannot be inherited passively, but must be actively renewed. The debate continues. What happened to the ordinary soldiers who survived the final orders? How did they process their experiences? How did they rebuild their lives? Millions of German soldiers were captured during the final months of the war and the immediate post-war period. Those captured by Western forces generally experienced relatively humane conditions. They were interned in prisoner camps, interrogated, eventually released. Many returned to their homes within months or a few years. Those captured by Soviet forces faced very different destinies. Approximately 3 million German prisoners were sent to Soviet labor camps. Conditions were frequently brutal. Forced labor, inadequate rations, and extreme weather killed hundreds of thousands. Some prisoners were not released until the mid-50s, a decade after the end of the war. The survivors returned to an unrecognizable Germany. The cities where they had grown up were destroyed. The families they had left behind were dispersed, dead, or transformed by years of separation. The social structures they had known had been replaced by Allied occupation, and eventually by two separate German states, with opposing political systems. Reintegration was difficult. Many veterans never spoke of their experiences. The trauma of what they had seen and done remained buried under silence. Families learned not to ask. Children grew up with emotionally distant fathers, whose night terrors were the only indication of horrors never verbalized. This silence had generational consequences. Children of veterans frequently reported growing up in homes where the past was taboo. They knew something terrible had happened, but did not know the details. Questions were discouraged or answered with evasions. The weight of the past was transmitted without explanation. Only decades later, when veterans aged and began to face their mortality, did some begin to speak. Oral history projects collected testimonies from survivors during their final years. These accounts, sometimes contradictory, frequently self-critical, occasionally self-exculpatory, provided valuable information about how participants experienced the events. A recurring theme was the feeling of having been swept along by forces beyond their control. Many veterans described feeling trapped in a machinery they had not chosen and could not stop. They acknowledged having committed acts that in normal circumstances they would have considered unthinkable. Some expressed genuine remorse. Others maintained justifications until the end. The psychology of participation in mass atrocities continues to be a subject of research and debate. How do ordinary people come to commit extraordinarily evil acts? What combination of social pressure, ideology, fear, and dehumanization produces genocidal behaviors. What psychological mechanisms allow perpetrators to live with themselves afterward? German veterans involuntarily provided a laboratory for these questions. Their experiences informed later psychological research on obedience, conformity, and diffuse responsibility. The famous Milgram experiments on obedience to authority were explicitly designed to understand how ordinary people had come to participate in the Holocaust. The conclusions were disturbing. Most people, under appropriate conditions, will obey instructions from authority figures, even when those instructions cause obvious harm to others. The situation matters more than individual character. Systems that distribute responsibility and provide ideological justifications can transform ordinary citizens into perpetrators of atrocities. These conclusions do not exculpate the perpetrators, but they do complicate simplistic narratives that divide humanity into good and evil. The capacity for cruelty exists in the majority of people. What determines if that capacity manifests are social structures, situational pressures, and available options. Societies wishing to prevent future atrocities must build institutions that make their commission difficult, not simply hope that their citizens will be morally superior to the Germans of 1945. How do Hitler's final orders compare with other historical examples of self-destructive leadership? Was the collapse of the Third Reich unique or part of a broader pattern? History offers numerous examples of regimes that chose destruction over surrender. Imperial Japan presents significant parallels. Like Nazi Germany, Japan continued fighting long after defeat was inevitable. Kamikaze attacks represented a doctrine of self-sacrifice that found merit in death itself. Orders to defend islands to the last soldier produced massacres similar to the German fortress cities. The decision to continue the war even after Hiroshima reflects the same disconnection between leadership and reality that characterized Hitler's final months. Only the direct intervention of Emperor Hirohito, breaking with precedent by directly addressing the nation, ended Japanese resistance. Without that intervention, the war could have continued with even more catastrophic costs. Other authoritarian regimes have shown similar patterns of self-destructive resistance. The Khmer Rouge Cambodia continued genocidal policies even when facing Vietnamese invasion. Pol Pot's regime preferred destruction over reform. The most fanatical followers fought to the end, incapable of conceiving alternatives. Apocalyptic cults frequently choose collective death over surrender. From Jonestown to Waco, charismatic leaders have demonstrated the capacity to convince followers that collective death is preferable to surrender or capture. Nazism shared elements with these movements: the cult of the leader, the apocalyptic vision, the certainty of special mission, the demonization of external enemies. When defeat became inevitable, some Nazis genuinely believed that death was preferable to living in a world dominated by their enemies. But what differentiated the Nazi collapse from other imperial downfalls? Why was the destruction so complete, so absolute? The answer lies in the unique nature of the regime. Traditional empires, when facing defeat, frequently negotiate. They seek to preserve what they can. They accept unfavorable terms. To avoid total annihilation, governments with legitimacy based on institutions can survive changes in leadership or territory. The nation persists even if the regime falls. Nazism lacked this flexibility. Its legitimacy rested entirely on Hitler and on the promise of racial victory. Nazism did not exist without Hitler. Purpose did not exist without domination. When victory became impossible, the regime lost all reason for being. The only option consistent with its premises was total destruction. This internal logic explains why the final orders were issued and why so many executed them. It was not simply individual madness. It was the logical conclusion of a system built on premises that allowed no alternatives. The generals who obeyed were not necessarily insane. They operated within a framework where obedience was the only visible option, where disobedience meant treason according to all criteria they had internalized. The system had been designed to produce exactly this result, The purges eliminated those who might have questioned. The propaganda convinced millions that the struggle was existential. Command structures concentrated authority in an individual increasingly disconnected from reality. Feedback mechanisms were systematically destroyed. When Hitler issued his final directives on April 15, 1945, barely hours before the Red Army began its final assault on Berlin, the system responded as it had been programmed to respond. Directives 73 and 74 established the chain of command in case land communications were interrupted. If Hitler remained south of the interruption, Admiral Dönitz would assume command in the northern zone. If he remained north, Field Marshal Kesselring would command the south. These directives revealed a fundamental paradox. Hitler implicitly acknowledged that he could be isolated, that the Reich would fragment, that the centralized command he had built would disintegrate. But even then, he insisted that orders must be followed, that designated commanders must execute the overall defense of the Reich in their zones independently if necessary. Directive 74 contained Hitler's final message to his soldiers on the Eastern Front. Soldiers of the German Eastern Front, he wrote, for the last time our mortal enemies have launched their massive forces to the attack. Their goal is to reduce Germany to ruins and exterminate our people. The message continued with warnings about the fate awaiting German women and children under Soviet occupation. The elderly and children would be murdered, women and girls reduced to barracks prostitutes, the rest sent to Siberia. This rhetoric was not entirely empty propaganda. Soviet atrocities against German civilians during the occupation of Eastern territories were real and extensive. Mass rapes, summary executions, looting. These realities provided a basis for the fears Hitler exploited, but they were also the direct consequence of Nazi policies in Soviet territory during the invasion. German crimes had guaranteed German reprisals. Hitler concluded his final directive with a cryptic reference to the greatest war criminal of all time, whose death would mark a turning point. He was referring to President Roosevelt, who died just days before on April 12th. This reference revealed the delusional hopes that persisted even in the final hours. Hitler and some followers genuinely believed that Roosevelt's death could fragment the Allied alliance, that differences between Western capitalists and Soviet communists would prevail over their common enmity toward Germany. They invoked the precedent of the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, when Empress Elizabeth's death saved Frederick the Great from certain defeat. But 1945 was not 1762. The Allied alliance did not fragment. Soviet forces began their final offensive mere hours after Hitler issued his directives. On April 16th, the 90,000 effectives of Buss's Ninth Army on the Silo Heights faced the weight of the Belarusian fronts of Zhukov and Konev. They resisted approximately 3 days before the front was completely torn open. But what happened to the final military plans Hitler designed to save Berlin? Why did they fail so completely? Hitler's final plan to save Berlin represented the culmination of his disconnection from reality. On April 20th and 22nd, he designed a strategy that, on paper, did not entirely lack military logic. General Felix Steiner's units, designated as Army Group Steiner, would attack southward to cut off Zhukov's penetration from the north. Simultaneously, Buss's 9th Army divisions, isolated south of Berlin in the Halbe Forest, would attack northward to link up with Steiner. Finally, Wenck's 12th Army, located west of Berlin, would reach the city to complete the rupture of the encirclement from the west. The plan failed because it ignored fundamental realities. The Army Group Steiner was a fiction. The units assigned to Steiner consisted of remnants of destroyed formations, military academy cadets, and maintenance personnel hastily converted into infantry. They did not possess the force, equipment, nor logistical support necessary to execute any significant counterattack. Steiner, an experienced commander, immediately recognized the impossibility of the order. He simply did not execute it. He did not have the means to fulfill it, and recognized that attempting it would only cause the meaningless annihilation of the forces under his command. When Hitler discovered that the counterattack had not materialized, he suffered the emotional collapse that several witnesses described as the most severe of the entire war. He shouted that he had been betrayed by everyone, that the generals were incompetent and cowards, that the German people had proven unworthy of his leadership. Buss's Ninth Army was completely surrounded. Short of ammunition and fuel, facing overwhelmingly superior forces. Instead of counterattacking toward Berlin as ordered by Hitler, Busse organized a desperate attempt to break the encirclement to the west. This direct disobedience saved tens of thousands of soldiers from death or Soviet capture. Wenck's 12th Army made a genuine attempt to advance eastward, not because Wenck believed he could save Berlin, but because he understood that an advance eastward could open an escape corridor for civilians and soldiers trying to flee. The 12th Army managed to establish contact with remnants of the 9th Army, but it never had a real possibility of reaching the capital. By late April, Wenck's advance had stalled, and his forces were pushed back toward the west. Although it was not a bad plan on paper, a later analysis concluded, it was completely impossible to execute due to the total weakness of the last military units in Germany. Thus, the last plan ordered by Hitler was never executed. What do these failures reveal about the nature of leadership in crisis? What patterns can be identified in the disintegration of Nazi command? The Nero Decree of March 19, 1945, represents perhaps the clearest example of Hitler's self-destructive orders. Our national struggle for existence obliges us to use all means, Hitler declared, even within the territory of the Reich, to weaken the fighting power of our enemy and prevent further advances. The decree ordered the destruction of all military traffic, communication, industrial, and supply facilities that could be used by the enemy: railways, bridges, communication lines, docks, power plants, factories, mines, dams. Everything was to be demolished before falling into Allied hands. Hitler entrusted the execution of this task to military commanders, but also to the Reich Defense Commissars and Gauleiters, administrative officials of the Nazi Party known for their fanaticism. The logic behind the decree was brutally simple. Hitler had declared that if the war was lost, the people would also be lost. It is not necessary to worry about what the German people will need for elementary survival, he said according to Speer's memoirs. On the contrary, it is better to destroy even these things, for the nation has proven to be the weaker, and the future belongs solely to the stronger peoples of the East. This declaration revealed the depth of the nihilism that had consumed Hitler. The German people, according to this logic, had failed in their historical mission. The survivors would be by definition the weakest elements. They did not deserve the tools of civilization. Those who were good had already died in combat. Only the inferiors would remain. The decree came after Hitler studied a memorandum sent by Albert Speer on March 18th. In that document, Speer reported that the German economy could only sustain itself for 4 to 8 more weeks. That was the absolute limit for the war effort of the Third Reich. Speer urged Hitler to concentrate on doing everything possible to ensure the survival of the population after the war. Hitler responded with the Nero Decree. But was it executed? Did Germany turn into the industrial wasteland that Hitler had ordered? The answer reveals as much about the limits of authoritarian power as it does about the capacity for individual resistance even within oppressive systems. Albert Speer, according to his own testimony, was horrified by the directive. He immediately understood that full implementation would condemn the civilian population to total collapse and massive suffering. Without power plants, cities would be left without electricity. Without bridges, food transport would be impossible. Without railways, the distribution of supplies would cease. The decree was a collective death sentence. Speer opted for systematic sabotage. He requested exclusive authority to implement the decree, then used that authority to convince generals and Gauleiters to ignore the instructions. He travelled personally organising passive resistance. He argued that the destruction was militarily unnecessary and civically catastrophic. The non-implementation of the Scorched Earth Decree was the first obvious sign that Hitler's authority was beginning to decline, that his will ceased to be fulfilled, observed historian Ian Kershaw. We are giving orders in Berlin that in practice no longer reach lower down, much less can be implemented, Goebbels commented at the end of March. I see in that the danger of an extraordinary diminution of authority. The result was irregular implementation. Some facilities were destroyed, particularly where fanatical SS officers supervised. Other places were saved by the quick action of local commanders. Some bridges were blown up, but many remained intact. Some industrial plants were sabotaged, but others continued operating until they were captured. Several Gauleiters and military commanders were ready to follow their orders, but quickly recognized that their effort was futile. Hitler might have been aware of the situation, but his arrogance did not allow him to acknowledge it. This could be the reason why he eventually granted Speer authority over the destruction project, a move that saved face for Hitler, while ensuring that the substance of the decree bogged down in bureaucracy. The destruction that occurred was significant, but much less than what was contemplated in the original directives. If the Nero decree had been fully implemented, Germany would have been reduced to a pre-industrial economy after the war. That many chose not to execute it, or found ways to minimize its implementation, saved countless German lives, and enormously facilitated post-war reconstruction. But what motivated those who disobeyed? Was it genuine humanitarian concern or simple calculation of personal survival? Motivations varied enormously. Some, like Speer according to his own narrative, were moved by the recognition that the destruction was morally indefensible. Others calculated that the war would end soon and they would be judged for their actions. Many simply lacked the practical means to implement large-scale destruction when explosives and military personnel were desperately needed at the front. Speer's case illustrates the complexities of these motivations. After the war, Speer carefully constructed an image of himself as the good Nazi, the apolitical technocrat who had tried to save Germany from Hitler's most destructive orders. His narrative of having sabotaged the Nero decree earned him some public rehabilitation. He was sentenced to 20 years at Nuremberg, a relatively light sentence considering his position. Speer claimed that during his last encounter with Hitler, on April 22nd in the bunker, he confessed to having deliberately disobeyed. Hitler supposedly became furious, but allowed Speer to leave. However, historian Richard Evans has described this account as pure invention. Later investigations revealed that Speer had been much more involved in crimes than he admitted. He had supervised forced labour programs that killed thousands. He had known the conditions in the concentration camps that supplied workers to his construction projects. His claims of ignorance regarding the Holocaust were contradicted by documentary evidence. Speer's narrative was a construction designed for personal survival more than an honest recounting of the facts. But regardless of Speer's exact motivations, the general pattern his case illustrates remains significant, even at the highest levels of the Nazi regime, even in the final weeks when intimidation was at its maximum and the consequences of disobedience potentially lethal. Some individuals found ways to resist the most destructive orders. These instances of resistance were exceptions precisely because they were rare. The norm was obedience driven by a combination of fear, ideological fanaticism, personal loyalty, and bureaucratic inertia. But the exceptions demonstrate that disobedience was possible. That the majority chose not to exercise that option reflects not only the pressures of the system, but also the individual choices of those who comprised it. What role did the Volkssturm play in this final phase? How were civilians converted into soldiers sacrificed in the final battles? The Volkssturm represented the regime's final and most desperate mobilization measure. Formally established by Hitler on October 18, 1944, this national militia conscripted all males between 16 and 60 years old who were not already serving in the Wehrmacht. Heinrich Himmler was named responsible for organization and training. Tactical operations would fall under the Wehrmacht, when units entered combat. The decision reflected absolute personnel desperation. By the end of 1944, the Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses on both fronts. More than 3 million German soldiers had died or been incapacitated on the Eastern Front since 1941. The Soviet offensives of 1944, particularly Bagration, had destroyed entire divisions. There simply were not enough trained men left to fill the gaps. The concept was inspired by the Prussian Landsturm of 1813 to 1815, which had fought against Napoleon as guerrilla forces. But the reality of 1945 was radically different. Despite Bormann's effort, who under Hitler's orders recruited almost 6 million, the intended force was never reached. In the end, approximately 700 battalions had been organised. The basic unit was a battalion of 642 effectives, composed mostly of Hitler Youth members, the elderly, people with disabilities, and individuals previously considered unfit for military service. Equipment was notoriously inadequate. Although there were attempts to provide military uniforms, these did not reach everyone. Many wore improvised uniforms or clothing from their civilian jobs. The brown uniform of the Hitler Youth was common, creating confusion on the Eastern Front where Soviet soldiers sometimes did not shoot them, thinking they were on their side. Weaponry was equally problematic. They received obsolete captured weapons or hastily manufactured ones. Some received World War I rifles. Others obtained weapons captured from French, Polish, or Czechoslovakian armies. Machine guns were scarce, artillery practically non-existent. The most effective weapon was the Panzerfaust, an anti-tank rocket launcher that required little skill and could effectively destroy tanks at short range. Training was minimal. Members were recruited starting in November 1944, but only 4 months later, the Red Army was entering East Prussia, and the Americans were crossing the Rhine. The Wehrmacht urgently needed all its experienced personnel at the front, leaving Volkssturm recruits without appropriate instructors. Hitler and Himmler insisted on filling these militias with nationalist fanaticism to determine them to fight until annihilation. For this reason, the Volkssturm did not operate under the direct control of the Wehrmacht, but under the direction of the Nazi Party. This dual structure created constant confusion. Units technically fell under military authority in combat, but remained under political supervision at other times. But how did these improvised units perform when they faced actual combat? Performance varied dramatically depending on the front and circumstances. On the Eastern Front, where soldiers feared Soviet reprisals and propaganda about Bolshevik atrocities resonated, units occasionally fought with determination. In Gumbinnen, East Prussia. In late 1944, Volkssturm formations managed to temporarily halt the advance of the Red Army. When they were well positioned with Panzerfausts and commanded by experienced officers, they could inflict significant casualties. On the Western Front, performance was different. The indifference of the regular army and the belief that Western allies did not seek annihilation convinced many units to flee or surrender. In Remagen, when they saw the regular army retreat, they simply surrendered. Without competent leadership and commanded by party incompetence, these units disintegrated at the first serious contact. The most extensive use occurred during the Battle of Berlin. Approximately 40,000 members of the Volkssturm, mainly youths, between 13 and 18 years old and the elderly, were used to defend the capital. They fought alongside remnants of Wehrmacht units against 3 Soviet armies, totaling more than 2 million soldiers. The result was inevitable from the beginning. Between 20,000 and 40,000 military and civilian deaths occurred during the battle. Large areas of the city were reduced to rubble. Casualty rates revealed the fundamental brutality of the sacrifice. During limited exposure to combat, Volkssturm units suffered losses of 70 or 80%. In the east, approximately 650,000 members saw action. Many perished. Others deserted when Nazi leaders fled. Units disintegrated when their political supervisors abandoned their posts, revealing that cohesion depended more on surveillance than on conviction. These were not professional soldiers dying in combat. They were forcefully conscripted civilians sent into hopeless battles. Adolescents whose only military experience consisted of Hitler Youth drills, elderly men who had served in the First World War decades earlier, individuals with disabilities who normally would have been excluded from military service. The Volkssturm represented the ultimate expression of the Nazi will to sacrifice its own population rather than accept defeat. But how did it all end? What were the final moments of the regime that had ordered so much destruction? On May 7th, 1945, General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the German army, signed the instrument of unconditional military surrender at the headquarters of General Eisenhower in Reims, France. We, the undersigned, acting by authority of the German High Command, hereby surrender unconditionally to the Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command, all forces on land, sea, and in the air, who are at this date under German control. The German High Command was to immediately issue orders to all German military, naval, and air authorities to cease active operations at 23:01 hours on May 8th. No ship, vessel, or aircraft is to be scuttled, or any damage done to their hull, machinery, or equipment. This specific clause prevented the final implementation of the Nero Decree on the remaining naval and air assets. The unconditional surrender of the Third Reich was signed in the early morning hours of Monday, May 7th, 1945, at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, in northeastern France. On May 8th, Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed a second surrender in Berlin before Soviet authorities to satisfy Stalin's insistence on a separate ceremony in conquered territory. The war in Europe had finished. Hitler had committed suicide 8 days earlier, on April 30th, while Soviet forces were fighting less than 500 meters from the Chancellery. Eva Braun died next to him. Their bodies were partially incinerated in the Chancellery garden and hastily buried in a bomb crater. Joseph Goebbels, appointed Chancellor of the Reich mere hours earlier, committed suicide the following day along with his wife Magda after she poisoned their 6 children. The leadership structure of the Third Reich had literally self-destructed. Donitz, operating from Flensburg near the Danish border, had tried for 8 days to selectively continue the war, surrendering forces to the Westerners, while still fighting against the Soviets. The Allies rejected this strategy and demanded unconditional surrender on all fronts simultaneously. Hitler's final orders had been as useless as they were predictable. They did not save Berlin. They did not stop the Soviets. They did not change the outcome of the war. They only prolonged the agony, caused more meaningless deaths, and added additional layers of suffering to an already immeasurable tragedy. What lessons remain from this catastrophe? What warnings do the final orders offer to future generations? The first lesson concerns the dangers of authoritarian leadership disconnected from reality. Hitler, in his final months, represents the extreme case of a leader, surrounded by sycophants who tell him what he wants to hear, isolated from accurate information about real conditions, convinced that personal will can overcome objective material limitations. This pattern is not unique to Nazism. Authoritarian leaders of all political stripes have fallen into similar traps. The tendency to punish bearers of bad news, to promote loyal subordinates over competent ones, to interpret any criticism as disloyalty. These behaviours inevitably produce decisions disconnected from reality. Institutions that allow negative feedback, that protect those who express legitimate doubts, that value accurate information over comfortable conformity. These institutions are essential to prevent similar catastrophes. The second lesson concerns the limits and obligations of obedience. The Nuremberg trials established the principle that following orders is not a sufficient defense for war crimes. Individuals retain moral responsibility for their actions even when acting under superior instructions. This principle has been incorporated into international law and in modern military codes. The cases of German generals who disobeyed, partially or completely, demonstrate that resistance was possible. Choltitz saved Paris. Speer, regardless of the exact veracity of his claims, at least tried to limit the destruction. Dönitz saved millions of lives with the Baltic evacuations. Heinrici preserved forces through flexible tactics. Wenck and Butzer saved tens of thousands by ignoring orders to counterattack toward Berlin. But they also demonstrate the costs and risks of disobedience. Many officers who questioned orders were dismissed, arrested, or executed. The Nazi system was designed specifically to eliminate the possibility of organized resistance. Individual disobedience was possible but dangerous. Collective resistance had been effectively prevented by the purges following July 20th. The third lesson concerns the importance of institutions that limit power. The Nazi system had systematically eliminated all institutional counterweights to Hitler's power. The parliament was a facade, the courts applied racist laws, the press propagated official lies, the army had been subordinated to the party, the churches had been neutralized or co-opted. In the absence of independent institutions, legitimate mechanisms did not exist to question catastrophic decisions. Modern democracies maintain separation of powers, freedom of the press, judicial independence, and other mechanisms precisely to prevent the concentration of authority that permitted Hitler's final orders. The fourth lesson concerns the fragility of civilization. Germany in 1933 was one of the most educated, industrialized, and culturally sophisticated societies in the world. It possessed prestigious universities, profound philosophical traditions, extraordinary scientific achievements. None of this prevented the descent toward barbarism. In barely 12 years, this advanced society produced the Holocaust, a war of racial conquest and systematic destruction that killed tens of millions. Hitler's final orders were the logical conclusion of premises accepted years earlier. The dehumanization of entire groups of people, the glorification of violence, the cult of the infallible leader, the subordination of all values to the nation. These ideas, when they are allowed to flourish without resistance, inevitably produce monstrous results. The final statistics tell the story in cold but devastating numbers. Between July 1944 and May 1945, more German civilians died than in all previous years of the conflict combined. More than 400,000 perished from Allied bombings. Up to 500,000 additional civilian deaths occurred as a result of the Soviet invasion and occupation of the eastern regions. 49% of all German military deaths in the Second World War occurred during the final 10 months of the conflict. Almost half of all German soldiers who died in 6 years of war perished after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler of July 20th, 1944. If the attack had succeeded and the war had ended in 1944, the lives of approximately half of the German soldiers who died could have been saved. The hundreds of thousands of civilians who perished during the final months would also have survived. The cities that were reduced to rubble in 1945 would have remained relatively intact. Hitler's orders to resist to total annihilation exponentially multiplied human suffering, without altering the final outcome of the war. Defeat was inevitable since the summer of 1944. Everything that followed was prolonged agony, unnecessary death, destruction that enormously complicated post-war reconstruction. Every city that resisted until being reduced to ruins required almost total reconstruction. Every division that was annihilated defending positions without value represented irreplaceable loss of human capital. The final cost of Hitler's orders is measured not only in the dead, but in the generations that followed. The orphans who grew up without fathers, the widows who never remarried, the traumatized veterans who never spoke of what they had seen, the rebuilt cities that lost their historical character, the demographic imbalances that affected German society for decades. But what do these numbers mean for us today? Why does it matter to remember these events decades later? Because the patterns that produced this catastrophe are not unique to the Germany of 1945. The tendency toward authoritarianism exists in all societies. The temptation to sacrifice liberties for apparent security persists. The appeal of charismatic leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems has not disappeared. The human capacity to dehumanize others, to commit atrocities when circumstances permit, remains latent. Hitler's final orders were executed by ordinary people operating within an extraordinarily perverse system. They were not exceptional monsters, but officials, soldiers, bureaucrats, who had internalized distorted values and operated under intense pressures. Many probably would have lived completely normal lives in different circumstances. This is perhaps the most disturbing lesson. The capacity to participate in atrocities does not require exceptional evil. It requires systems that allow it, ideologies that justify it, pressures that incentivize it, an absence of counterweights that prevent it. Societies that wish to avoid similar destinies must build and maintain institutions that make the abuse of power difficult. They must cultivate cultures that value critical thinking over blind obedience. They must protect legitimate dissent even when it proves uncomfortable. They must recognize warning signs before it is too late. Hitler's final orders represent the terminal point of a process that began much earlier. Every step on that path seemed reasonable to those who took it. Every concession seemed minor compared to the alternatives. Every warning was ignored as alarmism. Every opportunity to change course was wasted. By the time the orders of April 1945 were issued, it was already too late. The mechanisms that could have prevented the catastrophe had been dismantled years earlier. The voices that could have warned had been silenced. The institutions that could have resisted had been co-opted or destroyed. The time to prevent similar disasters is not when the final orders are being issued. It is much earlier, when the systems that will make them possible are being built. What physical traces remain of those final days? How have affected societies processed this traumatic memory? The bunker where Hitler spent his last days no longer exists, in its original form. After the war, Soviet authorities tried to destroy it, but the reinforced concrete construction resisted multiple demolition attempts. Eventually, it was partially excavated and filled in. Today, the site is marked only by a discrete information panel in an ordinary parking lot in the centre of Berlin. This deliberate absence of monumentalization reflects German ambivalence toward Nazi memory. Unlike other historical sites, there is no museum dedicated to the Führer's bunker. Authorities have resisted proposals to excavate it or turn it into a tourist attraction. The concern is that any preservation could become a place of pilgrimage for neo-Nazi sympathizers. The fortress cities that suffered massive destruction were rebuilt in various ways. Breslau, now Wrocław in Poland, was completely rebuilt after the war. The old town was meticulously restored, although with a completely different population. The Germans who survived the siege were expelled during the post-war population exchanges. The current city is Polish, inhabited by people without direct connection to the tragedy of 1945. Königsberg, now Kaliningrad in Russia, presents a different case. The city remained a Russian exclave after European borders were redrawn. The German Old Town was almost completely demolished during the Soviet era, replaced by Stalinist constructions. Little remains physically of the city that resisted and fell in 1945. Berlin shows its scars more visibly. Although reconstruction has transformed the city, certain sites preserve memory of the final days. The Brandenburg Gate, scene of fierce combat, was restored. The Reichstag, burned and bombed, was rebuilt with a modern glass dome that symbolizes democratic transparency. The graffiti of Soviet soldiers was deliberately preserved on the interior walls as a reminder. Holocaust memorials occupy prominent places in the Berlin urban landscape. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, with its 2,711 concrete blocks, extends near the site of the bunker. The topography of terror documents the crimes of the regime in the place where the headquarters of the Gestapo and the SS were located. The memorial to the German resistance remembers those who tried to oppose, including the conspirators of July 20th. These memorials represent the contemporary German commitment to memory and responsibility. They do not celebrate the Nazi past, but confront it directly, recognizing the crimes committed and remembering the victims. This approach, developed over decades of public debate, has made Germany an example of how societies can process traumatic pasts. The process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or confrontation with the past, became a central element of post-war German identity. The first generation frequently opted for silence. Veterans kept their experiences. Families did not ask what they had done during the war. It was only with the passing of decades that a more honest confrontation began to emerge. But what happened to the generals who survived? How did they process their participation in the catastrophe? The post-war period saw the emergence of what historians have called the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. According to this narrative, actively propagated by surviving German generals, the Wehrmacht had been a professional military force that fought with distinction, while the SS and other elements of the Nazi Party committed atrocities. The generals had obeyed legitimate orders, while attempting to moderate the excesses of the regime. This narrative was convenient for multiple parties. German generals used it to rehabilitate their reputations and avoid legal consequences. Western powers accepted it because they needed German military experience during the emerging Cold War. The new Federal Republic of Germany promoted it because it facilitated the reintegration of veterans into civil society. But the narrative was fundamentally false. Later historical research extensively demonstrated that the Wehrmacht had actively participated in war crimes, including massacres of prisoners, executions of civilians, and cooperation with Holocaust operations. Post-war memoirs written by German generals reflect this systematic distortion. Figures like Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, and others produced accounts that emphasized their military professionalism, while minimizing or completely ignoring their complicity with crimes. They presented Hitler as a madman who had ruined brilliant operations with amateur interference. They positioned themselves as victims of a system they had not chosen to serve. Only decades later, when the veterans aged and new generations of historians began to examine their archives with more critical eyes, the complete truth began to emerge. The generals who executed the final orders were not simply professionals following instructions. They were active participants in a criminal system that they had helped construct and maintain. Their decisions during the final months, whether of obedience or resistance, reflected not only external pressures, but also internalized values, personal ambitions, and calculations of survival. The complexity of their motivations does not absolve them of responsibility, but it does complicate simplistic narratives that divide humanity into absolute good and evil. The capacity for cruelty and the capacity for compassion coexist in the majority of people. What determines which manifests are the social structures, situational pressures, and available options. What do Hitler's final orders mean for our understanding of the Second World War? How do they alter the conventional narrative of the conflict? Traditional history frequently presents the Nazi defeat as inevitable once the war became global. The combined industrial superiority of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire would eventually crush Germany regardless of tactical decisions. Hitler's final orders, in this narrative, were simply the death throes of a doomed regime. But this perspective underestimates both the cost of the final orders and the alternatives that existed. The war could have ended months earlier with a dramatically lower human cost. If the July 20th attack had succeeded, if the conspirators had managed to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies or simply surrender, millions of lives could have been saved. The final orders were not inevitable. They were the product of specific decisions, taken by specific individuals operating within a specific system. Other decisions were possible. Other results were attainable. This understanding is crucial because it challenges historical determinism that can lead us to complacency. If the catastrophe was inevitable, then there was nothing that could be done to prevent it. But if it was the result of human decisions, then other decisions could have produced other results. And if other decisions were possible then, other decisions are possible now. The history of the final orders is ultimately a story about the consequences of human choices. Hitler's choices to issue suicidal orders, the general's choices to execute or sabotage them, the soldiers' choices to fight or surrender, the civilians' choices to flee or stay. Every choice had consequences. Some saved lives, others destroyed them. The responsibility for those consequences rests on those who made the decisions, not on abstract forces of history, not in inevitable circumstances, in people who chose to act in a certain way when other options existed. How should we remember these events? What obligations does this memory impose on generations who did not live it? Memory is not simply passive preservation of the past. It is an active act of construction that each generation must undertake anew. The events of 1945 do not remember themselves. They require institutions that preserve them, educators who transmit them, citizens who choose to pay attention to them. The temptation to forget is always present. The traumatic past is painful to confront. The lessons it offers are frequently uncomfortable. The connection to the present can seem tenuous, as direct witnesses disappear. But forgetting permits repetition. The patterns that produced Hitler's final orders have not disappeared. Authoritarianism persists. Dehumanization continues. Blind obedience continues to be rewarded in many contexts. Institutions that prevent abuses of power are always vulnerable to erosion. Remembering the final orders is not simply an academic exercise. It is an active warning about the dangers we face, about the decisions we must make, about the institutions we must protect. The history of April 1945 reminds us that civilization is fragile, that advanced societies can descend into barbarism, that ordinary individuals can participate in extraordinary atrocities, that systems designed to produce absolute obedience will eventually produce absolute catastrophes. It also reminds us that resistance is possible, that even within the most oppressive systems, some individuals find ways to preserve humanity, that the most criminal orders can be sabotaged, that disobedience, although dangerous, can save lives. Hitler's final orders failed not only because the regime lacked the resources to execute them, they failed because some individuals chose not to execute them, because Hitler's authority, although still feared, was no longer absolute, because the system he had built to guarantee total obedience had begun to disintegrate. This disintegration arrived too late to prevent the majority of the suffering, but it arrived. And its arrival demonstrates that even the most totalitarian systems are not invulnerable. This was everything about the final orders that Hitler gave to his generals and why they failed. A history of fanaticism and desperation, of blind obedience and silent resistance, of ordered destruction and saving sabotage, of millions of lives unnecessarily lost in the final months of a war that was already decided. Directives 73 and 74 of April 15th, 1945, were Hitler's last formal instructions to his armed forces. The Nero Decree of March 19th represented his attempt to destroy Germany rather than hand it over to his enemies. The Volkssturm was his last gamble to mobilize down to the last citizen in defense of a doomed regime. All these orders shared a common characteristic. They completely ignored the reality of the battlefield. They prioritized ideological symbolism over human survival. They demanded sacrifices that could not change the outcome of the war, and they were executed, sabotaged, or ignored, according to the decisions of thousands of individuals who faced impossible choices in extreme circumstances. Their decisions determined who lived and who died during those final months. Their decisions remind us that even in the most desperate circumstances, individual choices matter. And their decisions warn us about the consequences of building systems that eliminate the possibility of questioning, that reward blind obedience, and that concentrate absolute power in individuals increasingly disconnected from reality. Hitler's final orders were the logical product of such systems,